like programming had started to really blend with other forms of design. And so they realized very quickly that industrial design was never going to be the same, and they wanted to create a studio which merged those two worlds, digital industrial design, in a new way. And in fact, what's been really nice at Tellart is that those guys have, in doing so, like connected the practice to emerging technologies very explicitly. So it's not about digital specifically, it's not about industrial design as a form, but we also integrate engineering and architecture and other practices, graphic design, of course, film-based storytelling into our work. And it's a really nice mixture of stuff. So this is a really good example of how our favorite projects kind of are these big projects which have existed on the company's historical timeline as inflection points that kind of change our practice. And so this talk is one that we've, it's not like a, yeah, it kind of explains like how, it's not like a kind of chronological storytelling of how the project happens or a tour of a project in particular. It kind of explains how we're starting to think about our practice now in this context and how it mixes some of these things that we've done in the past. So the first thing to talk about is this notion of the strange present. And for us, what we've realized is that it is a very unusual time right now. We're seeing an extraordinary pace of change in society, something that we've never experienced before. There is change happening left, right, and center, political change, technological change, economical change. We are really, really feeling that it's much less predictable than it ever has been. Where it's a huge amount of uncertainty which is happening all around us. Let me just give me a brief second while wait a minute. Hold on, just a second. Sorry, excuse me. I'm just going to change my view so I can see what slide is coming up next. It will just help me. Sorry, Facebook. No, I did that. It's all right. Yeah, don't worry. I've just got to customize this thing so that I can see what I'm doing. Excuse me a second. How do you do that? Maybe I need to do this. Nope. Yes, no. Nope. Wait, how do I do that? No, I'm just, this is it. This is what I want. I've got it. All good, sorry. So this is the next slide. So, thank you. So this is this concept that was introduced in the late 1980s in this US Army War College, VUCA. And it was a term which was used to help officers train for strategy on the battlefield, to try and help them describe this state of flux on the battlefield, which is constantly changing, always uncertain. It's been kind of introduced to the business world now. And what it stands for is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And these four words kind of sum up this strange present that we find ourselves in which everything is changing so fast. The facts on the ground are undefinable. Everything's super intertwined in terms of ecosystems. It's networks in life all around us today. And so in the context of different industries, this means different things. But at the end of the day, it's a moment of extraordinary pace of change which has impact in the future, which is really difficult to define. And we find ourselves feeling kind of ungrounded, I guess. This is a quote that we drew from William Gibson's Pattern Recognition. It says, "Fully imagined cultural futures were the luxury of another day, one in which now was of some greater duration. For us, of course, things can change so abruptly and violently, so profoundly, that futures like our grandparents have insufficient now to stand on. We have no future because our present is too volatile." And so it talks about this now being so moving so quickly and so undefinable that there are only kind of weak signals. We don't really know what the present actually is anymore. And the truth of it is that when you have a present like this, it robs us of our ability to steer what the future is. And so this notion of futures and futurism and trying to use the future as a tool with which to imagine where we want to be is something that's really important, because today we don't really know where we're going, and it's very difficult to feel like you're in control when technology is pushing you around. So this is a sort of, I'm going to do this actually since we have more time today. Normally I have to skip over this, but so first of all, like, we use this in workshops to explore people's relationship to the future. First, we introduce this vertical axis in which people try and place themselves on this graph of when they're thinking about the future. Do they feel optimistic about the future, or do they feel pessimistic about the future? So I'm going to ask you guys, since there's only 30, well, I don't know how many, but who feels pessimistic about the future? Okay, so like 7 of you. Who feels optimistic about the future? So I'd probably double that. Some kind of like, who's in the middle? Okay, right. And what about the other way, like in terms of low influence and high influence? Do you feel like you have the ability to shape the future? Who says no? Okay, and who says yes? Okay, so who said I'm pessimistic and I have no ability to influence the future? What are you doing as an architect? What are you doing as an architect? Explain yourself.
I think that the same is with Facebook now, that we think that we have a lot of influence, but I think that our real influence is just very, very low. I think the influence is a bigger root, like when there are like or like strikes going on. This is a bigger thing. But as a singular person, my influence is just very low.
Okay. And who said they're optimistic and they had, I'm not going to necessarily ask you like to justify yourself, but who said optimistic and high influence? Plenty of you did. Own up to it. Okay. I want to ask someone that's not on the front row. Do it again. You are on the front row. Okay, this chap over here. Sorry, I don't know everyone's names. Ren. Oh, Ren. Hello, Ren. I'm glad that you said that.
Yeah. I think it's important that we know, not as a singular. I think we should stop thinking as a singular and therefore as an accumulated collective. We have quite high influence to decide. So if we don't agree with Facebook, we don't use Facebook. Of course, we can't design Facebook, but as a collective, we can just say, no, we don't agree, we don't support it, and see where it goes. So I'm pretty optimistic.
Yeah, okay. So, right, yeah. So I'm totally with you, I have to be honest. Like, I think that, like, in this world, it's incredibly easy to misinterpret. Like last night, for example, I had this exact debate with my wife. She just got in, she had a horrible day with the baby, totally exhausted. It's 10 minutes to 9 o'clock. The voting booth closes at 9 o'clock. I'm like, we're going to go and vote. And she's like, I'm not going to go and vote. I can't do this. I'm so tired. This is it. This is the same thing, you know? Like, if everybody was not going to vote, then of course it wouldn't make a change. But if everybody actually felt influenced, then they would be able to shift things. And of course, these days it's about all kinds of stuff. It's not just voting. Voting is an obvious thing, but it's about like which brand of chocolate bar you buy. It's about like whether you buy organic stuff or not. It's about the ideologies which underpin everything these days, which aren't very legible. So this is just a kind of like a part of the process we go through. And I'm going to share this project which we did out in Dubai, which was done for the government agency in Dubai, the Prime Minister's office actually. And we hadn't really worked for a government agency like that in the past. And actually this was my first project with Tela. And strangely enough, I was on a boat in Amsterdam. And I met this chap who's now my boss. And he's like, he was like, we've been asked to create an installation, like a big 1,000 square meter installation that allows people to experience the future of their country. And I was like, wow, like, why wouldn't anyone do that? So I quit my job and did that. And it was the best thing that I ever did, I have to be honest. It's an incredibly interesting journey. So this is the journey. So Dubai is a really interesting context for this kind of exploration. And of course, under normal circumstances, like this is something I need to explain, but for architects, it's kind of obvious. In 40 years, it's gone from a sort of desert wasteland in which there were people still like diving for pearls and very low kind of infrastructure, not much in the way of economy, to a booming megalopolis in which it's an extremely techno-utopian kind of technocentric society, always looking for the next thing, always buying the next car. And of course, there's a very peculiar set of economic constraints which has allowed this to happen. And so in this world of extraordinary growth, what you see is that, and with their economic abilities as a sort of oil-producing or soon-to-be not oil-producing country, they're able to kind of pick the different parts of the world that they really like according to the values that they have and curate things and, you know, kind of leapfrog different parts of society, or not, as the case may be. And so this pace of change is especially important to engage with. And actually, although like when you think of the Middle East, you might not think of it being extremely progressive. This country is extremely progressive. And this guy here is, you know, they are an outlier in the region for sure, and they're all about finding ways to progress forward and become more integrated. And there are some conservative factions in the place for sure, but there's a real expectation that that there's meaningful progress all the time and making lives better. And this is summed up in what they call the ruler's bargain, in which there's this unspoken relationship between yourself as a member of the public and this chap who's the Prime Minister of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed, in which he will look after you. He will take care of you as a populace, and you only have to be subservient to him for as long as he's looking after you. And they take this very, very seriously. It's a really interesting place in which they experiment wholeheartedly and they're not scared to fail. And I have to say, in this journey, I've never ceased to be amazed at the risks they're willing to take, and perhaps, you know, only they are able to take as well. And as part of that innovation drive, we've been sort of involved in order to create this object that you see in front of you, which is in the context of what basically is like the Middle East World Economic Forum. It's called the World Government Summit. And when we started in 2014, it was a relatively new event. I think they were in their second year, and they had something like 2,000 or 3,000 people going there. And they rebranded to the World Government Summit. And now there's like 6,000, 7,000 people there, and it's like, you know, you have Christine Lagarde and like all of like big important business people as well, as all of the government leaders. They're really growing this. So it's an interesting context in which to explore what the future could be. And this is actually beyond just exploring what the future could be. From the government's perspective, this is about conducting real futures foresight exercises and providing proposals to help people reimagine what the future could be and reimagine how they engage with this concept of the future. It's creating a vision for them. But what it manifests as are high-fidelity prototypes of plausible future scenarios. So this is the Shell Futures world taken to another level. It's a tool for planning for the government, which is really interesting. And so we have to take this very seriously. You can't just go in front of an audience of world leaders and say, here, this is my pipe dream of the future. Like, it has to start with some real research. And so we've kind of invented our own methodology alongside by drawing on other people that we've worked with to study the culture and study the land. And we did lots of nice little visits to ministries around the country and figure out how they did their business, but also involve people from different places around the world, some futurists, some filmmakers. One of these guys here is an underground artist from Detroit called Onyx, who turned up in a pair of 3D printed sandals that he'd made himself and wore like a 3D printed skull musical instrument. That's the guy there. And he's never had a bank account for the past 10 years. He's only used his Bitcoin. We're trying to gather like different perspectives from the world in order to validate new ways of looking at what the future might be like, different worldviews. It's important to say that not all of these people are experts, they're also non-experts. And what we've tried to explore is how to navigate this world of volatility, uncertainty, and complexity, and so on, into something which we can understand and navigate as designers. And what we didn't really know, actually, going into this project, was actually there's a whole load of methodologies out there already which can help you navigate this kind of stuff. Some of these things you could dig into really deeply. I'll just gloss over a few of them. The top left-hand one is this concept of pace layers, like different elements of our society changing at different rates. So nature being something that turns really, really slowly, culture is a bit faster, and infrastructure is even faster, and so on, until you have fashion, which is a self-referential, diabolical, intertwisted loop of never-ending change. The futures cone, which if you haven't come across that, is really, really interesting to look up as well. If you position yourself in the left-hand side of that diagram, and you're looking out into the future, then you have this wide array of alternate futures that might happen. And so this is the possibility space mapped. And then the darker, or rather the more opaque areas in the middle of that area are the things which are more likely to happen, and the things which are, let's say, like the white one is like the most likely stuff to happen, and then the sort of mid-gray is the desirable future. It's futures which might happen and that we want to happen, but aren't necessarily likely. And so this is a tool to try and, to first demonstrate this idea of plurality, that you can have many different futures that could happen, and it's about steering towards which ones and mapping that out. Jim Data, I would definitely look up him. He's a really interesting character. I met him in a conference last year in Brussels. He tells us that actually all of the futures in the world, whether you look at a scientific or a sort of strategic future from Shell or a sci-fi movie, they all fit into one of these archetypes of growth and collapse, discipline, transform, and so on. So like utopian, dystopian, discipline, like a sci-fi movie like, let's see, Running Man, like lots of interesting work there. And this one here, which I'll talk about briefly, which is actually a kind of map that we've been using from Stuart Candy about how to create experiences of the future. And this is about first defining the context in which the scenario that we're developing happens, like the big push-pull of the world that's forcing mass migration, climate change, economic disparity, and so on. And then going into a scenario, so we're talking about a specific thing that happens in this world that we want to tell the story of, and then we create an individual situation. So for the scenario, it might be Bitcoin takes over the education system in a new way. The scenario is a school in which there's a classroom. We don't know what's going on, but the situation is that there's a teacher that's telling off a kid in this world. How do we play out this situation in this context? So it's kind of like the scales when you're designing for different scales. But then the most important thing is the stuff. Like, what are the physical objects that actually exist in this world? How do we use, what are the interfaces to technology and systems that we use? I use this and I use that, and I have a healthcare system and I have a school teacher. But the products and services that we interact with in our daily lives are really useful storytelling techniques to help us unpack what this world might be like. And this is what we ended up doing in the Museum of the Future. So I'm going to go through some of the explorations that we've done, starting with healthcare, education, and infrastructure, and try and explain how they manifested. So we started, I should say that we've done 4 of these projects now. They have been annual. The first one started something like 5 months ahead of when it was supposed to launch, and that nearly killed me. And then the last year we had something like 9 months. And so we've built out the project to create much more of a tail, which is all of the strategic thinking in which we created all of these scenarios. Because we ended up having to present to the government like how we ended up at these things and what the events from today into the future, like how we join the dots and prove plausibility. But for healthcare, for example, we provided a scenario in which healthcare transforms from a reactive system into one which is active and preventative. It's distributed everywhere and it's holistic. It takes into account your whole life rather than just a single thing, just a single instance, which is your symptom. And we presented this bathroom of the future in which, as part of your daily routine, you would step up to your bathroom sink, and then you would have an interaction with your algorithmic general practitioner who would be able to, who would help you live your life more healthily. So he would say, for example, oh, good morning. Actually, it's not such a good morning. 3 of your colleagues at work have actually come down with a cold, so you might want to consider working from home. And because there's lots of illness going around, we've augmented your breakfast with some extra vitamin C. But since you're working from home, there's a low pollution factor out today, so perhaps you want to go for a run and increase your exercise this week. So the preventative healthcare becomes something when you have like your bed, which knows exactly how much you've slept, and your wristwatch, which knows how much you've exercised, and we had artifacts on display like a smart fork, which is a connected fork, which would monitor the chemicals that you're ingesting with every mouthful, like the kind of quantified self stuff that is kind of becoming embedded in products more and more. Then you ended up with a much more intelligent healthcare system that was actually able to guide you towards wellness rather than respond to your illness, which is a really powerful idea. And for this one, this is we didn't diagnose, but we found that obesity is a #1 health issue in the UAE. And so, like, how could we introduce a healthcare system which was a diagnostic tool, but also combated obesity? Because everyone in the UAE, of course, it's an inhospitable environment. You always spend your whole day in a shopping mall or indoors. So rather than outside exercising, how could we create an immersive healthcare game? And so we created this space which was fully projection mapped, which was all about diagnosing your body for movement and flexibility, and at the same time giving you a workout as part of your in-mall shopping experience. And what's incredible about a place like the UAE is that it's not easy to take for granted that these things, like you might imagine a game space like this as something that, oh, this is a business that springs up in a shopping mall, kids would put money in like an old arcade. Actually, lots and lots of businesses that you see as private enterprise in the UAE is actually owned by the government. All of the taxis are owned by the government. Loads of the hotels are owned by the government. All of the petrol stations are owned by the government. And so when you have this kind of world in which it's okay, like Emirates Airlines and so on, it's okay for the government to be making profit, it's really interesting to try and explore what different healthcare models might exist and how they integrate with the urban environment, given the kind of lifestyle that people lead over there and are likely to lead more and more in the future. So this was another healthcare experiment that was in a later year, which was a kind of like a cross between a pharmacy and a juice bar. So we're creating an immersive experience in which people could, oh, I don't know what happened there, that's weird. Don't die. Could ingest different food and drink as part of a hospitality experience. So in Dubai, of course, everything happens in hotels. So why is healthcare something that still happens in hospitals? Couldn't healthcare, if it's something which is preventative and something which is distributed all the time, know how to give you vitamins and how to medicate you even in a more hospitable environment in which you're socializing with your friends and so on. And it's amazing culturally how these kind of ideas resonated. Moving on to education, patterns of education that point to education being something that happens more out there in the world as an experience, something that's more collaborative and exploratory, brought us to this vision of what a sandbox, how a sandbox might be this is very much more like a product of the future, which exists today already, but isn't in the school environment. how kids could be learning about the geology of the land, water tables, and so on, by collaboratively exploring using a hands-on interactive interface like this. And actually, we've now developed this, because this was built on an open source project, but we've developed it further, and we've incorporated machine learning now, so that when you're making mountains like this, it maps on generated satellite images. So you're kind of like simulating what it would be like if you terraformed the Earth. And this is going to be in the V&A Museum in their upcoming Futures exhibition, which is happening in London later this year, which is really exciting. But then further than that, we were trying to imagine what it would be like in a world in which you're able to synthesize new life. So what if you could synthetically engineer new plants, and how would that be taught in a classroom, for school kids of the future, in which engineering new biology is going to be an everyday sort of thing? And how do these school kids work with industry? And so we created this game in which you sit around the table and engineer new plants that are competing on this inhospitable environment to see which plants are successful. And successful plants would then be sent to the lab and be made in real life rather than in the gaming experience. And that's along the top. They've got like a live connection to the lab. And the idea is that like school children are playing an active role in industry, while at the same time learning with a simplified building blocks of synthesizing new life forms for creating new food in a place like Dubai in which nothing grows. And this was an immersive learning environment in which we've already traveled to Mars and started to colonize it. So what would education look like if there was already a group of people living on Mars? And how could we teach people about what it's like to live on another planet? Well, we could have a telepresent experience in which you're guided by people who are actually on the planet now farming, and explore how their life is different to what it's like. Actually, it doesn't look that dissimilar from Dubai, to be honest, if you go out into the desert, but that's what they found. So talking beyond education to infrastructure, what if the city became something that was information rich and automated in a way that it isn't today? Infrastructure today is actually quite slow moving and slow to change, but what if it became flexible? And so we had to create this immersive environment in which the fabric of the world simulated the city. So intriguingly, like this big display system at the front here was the only way that we could figure out how to augment a real cityscape virtually without having people wear, I mean, this was, let's see, 2015, so none of the augmented reality apps that exist today were out, and people weren't willing to wear headsets. But how can we storytell what a city might be like where it's layered with information? So when you came in through the front door, which is back here, you got to see a live augmented view of the street that's in front of you, and you could see people walking behind it, and it would explain what was going on in the city, what investment opportunities lied in different buildings, some sort of dynamic wayfinding and so on, and your smart bus was about to turn up around there, so new forms of mobility. And then also like a sensor-driven environmental control, so that you could actually, this is a collaboration with Carla Ratti in MIT, which is like a street-based air conditioning, so that it was misting you based on where you were in the street. It created more habitable spaces. Interestingly, I don't know, like since this exhibition, they've developed this whole crazy area of Dubai. I forget what it's called off the top of my head, but it's kind of like it's a bit like Disneyland, where you go and there's like Little Italy and stuff. It's like a shopping mall environment, but it's all outdoors. And they seem to be air conditioning the whole street, which is absolute crazy madness for me, but so I need to look that up as to how they're doing that, but it feels cool there. So I'm wondering if they found a way to do that. And this, of course, is part theater, and so we're trying to find ways to get people excited about what it looks like when the streets are no longer just something that you work on, but actually all of the dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs are done by robots, and the streets are reprogrammable. So instead of street workers, you have street programmers. And what does that mean for our jobs? Because actually, there's an interesting pattern about technology in our lives, and it's true that although like there's a lot of worry about the singularity when computers become completely more intelligent, and there's a more intelligent general intelligence than we have, there's a bigger story of decreasing human agency, and what happens where like technology first invades our bodies, and then it becomes something we socialize with, and then it becomes something which is more controlling us. And this hypothesis of a decreasing human agency was something that led us on to creating this subsequent exhibition about the human body, because this is something which will become, with artificial intelligence and advanced robotics, more mediated, more mechanized, and even networked. So what does that mean for our lives? How's that going to impact our lives? And we created this retail space. The museum became like a kind of like a future Apple shop mixed with a kind of cosmetic surgery environment, in which you would be able to test out different products by walking into this space, which we call the augmentation spa. And there are all of these, ooh, that video is going a bit cranky. There are all of these products which fictional products which we invented, which you would be able to see on display and test out. And in testing them out, we were creating fake advertisements. We were creating virtual reality experiments. This is a game in which your knees were going to be replaced by new knees to augment your ability to jump physically. This is mood view, so you'd be able to look around and like read people's expressions that are from different cultures. The machine learned kind of algorithms would be able to tell you what other people are feeling in a way that you weren't able to. Or what if your visual streams would be something that you're actually able to share? So going beyond Facebook and Instagram and sharing me, what if all of your pupils were something that actually could be shared dynamically with your social networks? What would that world be like, and would you be willing to purchase it? And we were handing out brochures, and at the very tail end of the experience, you would actually order stuff using an iPad. And it's amazing that people were ordering things, which brings me on to another story about the way that we are trying to create a kind of suspension of disbelief. These are immersive spaces in which we're storytelling what we thought were obviously fictional scenarios, things that don't exist today and that aren't going to exist for the near future. And yet some people, I mean, they just believe it. They just believe that these things are products that they can buy. And we had our first experience of this in the first exhibition, in which we did like a version of border control, like an immigration experience when you're getting your passport checked. And we were challenged because they thought that was a very inhospitable experience and it didn't represent them culturally. And so they wanted to know in the future how technology might be able to change this and what the impact of technology might be. And so we created this very, very hospitable experience in which you were given a cold hand towel. It's a traditional welcome there where it's very hot. And so you cool yourself down and you go through these sensors, and then your body is scanned for weapons and so on. All of it's just LEDs and fiction and connects with displays. And then you give back your hand towel and it gets dropped into this scanner and it gets scanned for communicable diseases, which everyone was very shocked about. They're like, what, you're scanning those are my skin, that's my skin that you're scanning. But then one woman came up to us, and some people are, like the Ministry for Transport, they were really excited by this idea that actually it was going to be a welcoming experience and it's something they wanted to aspire to. And yet this other lady came through who was pregnant, and she was really worried because she thought that this was a real product test. And she asked us if the scanners that she had just walked through had harmed her unborn baby. And of course, it's pregnancy is very anxiety-inducing for anyone who's gone through it, and that's very natural. But it astounded us. We had no expectation that people would actually believe that these are real products. But it goes to show that most people don't feel like they have agency in this world, and that they're just given these things and that they happen to us. And actually, this whole project was about putting people into these situations to have them feel what it might be like in this future, and to come to some kind of like perspective on whether they wanted this future. That was a bit of a ramble, but going back to domestic space. Domestic space, of course, is already being invaded by sort of pseudo-sentience, Alexa and so on, but it's being augmented by things which eventually will become empathic. They'll be able to feel what we feel. And so if we have a space in which can be completely, it can manipulate your understanding of your home world in this way, what if it could actually engage with you on a much more emotional level? And if you look here, this is a projection map space. Actually, the space is a lot smaller than this, but it feels bigger when you walk into it, and then it completely transforms your living room into a gaming environment. So when you have this little being that welcomes you home every day, what would it be like to come home to an artificial intelligence that actually wanted to cheer you up by gaming with you? And so we explore what if this childlike being welcomed you home versus, I seem to have skipped one. There was a middle one, which I seem to be missing the slide here, but it was more like a caring spouse that would help you relax and set you down into a massage chair, and your room would turn into a kind of tropical environment. And this one is like what happens when we actually put our babies and most vulnerable people into the care of an artificial intelligence, and allow this artificial intelligence to rock your baby to sleep. Do we feel comfortable with letting go to that degree? And what was interesting in this environment is that actually they were really comfortable with letting go, really comfortable with giving their care. I mean, I have a little detector that I have a 3-month-old baby. I have a little detector which tells me whether my baby's still breathing. And it's amazing how I feel extraordinary comfort just watching this little thing go like, yep, still breathing, you know. So anytime I wake up in the night, I just look at it and it's like, yep, he's cool. But like, would you allow it to take complete ownership? They're saying yes, because they already have nannies in every single home, like nannies from other cultures who they don't really relate to and don't speak the same language as, come in, and they're not really, they're not really one of them. They're not part of the family. So this is a future which they really felt positive towards, which was strange to me. And beyond that, governance. Like, we're of course talking about government futures, and all of these things are, in a way, trying to steer the government towards the kind of interventions they can make to make people's lives better. But what about government itself? What if governance becomes something which is everywhere all the time, but it also has to be ethical? It's because it's making decisions about our daily lives in an algorithmic way. And so we invented this super sci-fi government data processing facility in which all of the big decisions of the country are being made in real time. And this device in the center, this kind of like orb of like intelligence, symbolized all of the thousands and billions of data points which are being analyzed from the traffic streams around the world to the economic transactions which are happening on a day-to-day basis. And we called it the UAE hypermind. And we wanted to know what people felt like when they lost complete control, these being the people which were in control of the country. And the way that we did that was we had this hypermind, this fictional kind of intelligence, give all of these government workers a job interview. And of course, your job, the career that you choose and the way that you choose to spend your hours every day is something that we feel defines us, our identity, what purpose we have in this land and this life. And in this situation, the system was actually telling you not just, it was kind of asking you oblique questions about how you would perform in certain situations. Would you behave like this in this situation? Would you behave like this in this situation? And it felt like they were kind of weird interview questions to be asked, really unusual for them. And then they just get given a job. they don't get any agency at all anymore. And actually, interestingly, this made people feel really uncomfortable, like more than, like they really didn't want to be told what to do. Because it started to talk about how ethically decisions were being made by this system and what role we were playing in this decision-making process. And they found this really, really compelling, and so we actually took this particular idea out further and developed this into what we called the moral machine. And this was explicitly about how humans can start to shape the ethical dilemmas which artificial intelligences are going to face when they're making all of our decisions for us. And we presented this at the World Economic Forum to like the bigger version of the government summit, in which there were many more world leaders kind of thinking about how these decisions are being taken for them, basically. And it's a really interesting situation in which this system is basically allowed to act in the best interest of society for us. Like, how do we feel about that? And actually, they were really excited because I guess like it provides them, like these are for now, they're translation systems. It's like a pseudo control. It feels like we're in control, but this is just translating millions and millions of data points into means of giving us the sensation that we're in control, whereas actually we're probably not. But they felt like, yeah, like we want to be able to guide these systems on making decisions for us, and actually that's a very positive future. We want that, which is really, really feels really, really strange to me. And of course, yeah, we always have this slide because it's really important to mention that like these projects became absolutely enormous. Like we're only, well now, when I started we were only like 15 people in the whole company. Now we're something like 40-ish. But we scale up from like a team of like 4 to like 60 odd people every time we do these kind of projects. And I'll just graze over the last one that we did because I feel like I'm already going hoarse. This is a really interesting one that we decided to try and steer towards what would happen in a future in which we failed to adequately address climate change. Like, how do we talk to a country and the leaders of country whose country is amongst the worst polluting in the world to think differently about their agency towards what kind of future they want to create post-climate change. And so we started with this incredibly bleak, dim animation, which showed like and it had this voiceover about the amount of struggle that we're going to have in reaching this point. And then it's because, of course, like there is a point in which if we don't address climate change, we might be extinct, and that's a really crazy and sobering fact. So how do we present this optimistically? And so we invented this kind of post-climate change world in which the UAE as a country steered its way towards innovations which would be exported to the rest of the world and basically narrowly avert like worldwide catastrophe and start telling the story of what those innovations might be. And they're wildly fictional. You know, this is so we basically went back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, how are we going to get water? How are we going to get food? How are we going to get shelter? Like what we're going to live in a very, very different environment in which it's going to be a real struggle to survive. And so we addressed, for example, water with enormous plants which are desalinating the sea after having created genetically, like merging, what was it again? The DNA of jellyfish with mangrove roots, which are nature's, jellyfish of course is like a big like water filter, and mangrove roots are nature's natural desalinator. And so this fictional kind of enormous plant in which they're able to provide water for masses of people off the coast of Dubai and then export. What does farming look like, and what does the creation of food look like in a post-climate change world? Well, we talked long and hard with lots of climate change experts about the ways in which resilience might manifest, like the distributed nature of food, like just creating just enough food for the population that's in one part of the urban environment at a time, how it might be to dynamically create new farms like we do now with data servers, data data farms. And of course, they got really, really excited about this. And we had even like a chef behind the scenes creating these fictional pieces of food that you could taste that were made of insects and artificially created nutrients. And people were like, it was really, really interesting because we made these little things, super crunchy olive tapenade cubes from seeds and whatnot. And we told people that they were insects, and they ate them, and they were like, like that kind of, the full immersion was really, really important. And this thing was this idea of how do we create rapidly deployable urban infrastructure? And so it's kind of way out there, but we created this gaming environment in which you're able to deploy this kind of these self-extracting city kits, which would replicate cultural environments that we've got around the world today robotically, in order to take advantage of pieces of inhabitable climate where they existed. And then beyond that, having people actually make a commitment towards a particular future. So we try to always be collecting data about how people feel in these different situations. And this one, as an example, was like a kind of, which was a commitment to the government about like what kind of investment they should make and what they should research. And this is just like a really nice way to activate people's minds into how they have agency in their jobs. And so anyway, I'll wrap up. But just to reflect on the futures as a practice, for us, like futures has become something that we use as a mode of critique. It's a way to reframe critique as something which is critical, as critique as being intentional and aspirational. So these are prototypes that we feel that we want to provoke people with, and some of them are like teetering on the edge of dystopian, and some of them are clearly utopian. But at the end of the day, we're saying this could change our lives for the better. Is this a future we want to aim towards or not? And beyond that, futures are a force for change. This is about exploring alternative possibilities and actually taking concrete action towards that. And it's intriguing for me now that in the first year we had provided, amongst 1,000 other things, for example, reframing ministries, government ministries, and rebranding ministries in order to shift public perspective. And we invented for them the Ministry of Happiness and the Ministry of Second Life Education and so on, the Ministry of Artificial Intelligence. And today they have, I think the first, don't quote me on this, but I think the first female minister was the Minister for Happiness. She was our client in the first project. Now they have a Minister for AI, and he was a part of the second year. Like, it's kind of coming true in a strange sort of, I can't take credit for that, but it's incredible how initiatives have been created and mindsets have been shifted through the choices that they're making. And then, of course, using this mindset and sharing this for ourselves as something that shows us how actually we do have influence and we do have agency to shape the future, especially in a context like this, like architects, holy shit, like you guys are making the future every day. Like it's all kinds of futures are being created in your office as I walked around it today. So you should certainly feel agency. And ultimately, for us, of course, this is a communication vehicle. This is branded as a museum, but really, it's a marketing piece. This is splashed in all of the newspapers in the region. This is on billboards in places. They were incredibly clever at using the material that we created as experiences that were spatial, that you could walk around and were immersive, in order to transform what people would imagine. Because the idea is that that what we imagine to be the future is probably, if we're imagining this collectively, this is kind of what happens. And this is summed up nicely in this quote from Sheila Jasanoff. And she says that socio-technical imaginaries are collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures. So she's saying that effectively, if we all imagine what future we want to have, this is the future which will be steered towards, because these are the things which will be created for certain markets and so on. it's incredibly powerful if we can change people's mindsets. And so it's a huge marketing exercise. And it makes us call into question how we're telling these kind of stories and how we're creating these aspirational futures or not in institutions like museums. And for us as a practice, we're not, we're not a government organization. We're not creating policies, but we are creating a more real and tangible version of a report. Like this whole thing was actually created when the client was like, no one reads these massive research reports that we pay millions towards. How can we get people enthused and engaged by what's possible in the future and what the impact of these technologies are going to be in a way that they can feel? And so for us, this is about prototyping and making stuff that you can actually interact with. These are the materials of our lives. So we chose to work, for example, with marble and wood and shiny things because it felt like materials which they are engaged with in their daily lives, in all of the posh hotels that you go out there every day. And gaming, like making stuff through prototyping is what we do all the time. It's about like, you can't really call something a valid prototype unless it works. And so for us, it's about erecting these constraints and trying to test our hypothesis and make something real as much as possible. And beyond that, this is really a storytelling exercise where we're creating these extraordinarily complex spaces where we have this mixed mediums of screens and projections with hard, like the ball that they're holding there is this retro-reflective surface which is being detected, but it also has an iPhone-like thing inside it, so it's detecting as well. Like they're incredibly technology-enriched surfaces, but the idea is that it's about storytelling. So every decision that we take about the color and the shape of the space is to further enhance the different layers of storytelling that we're trying to tell to different audiences within this government environment. And ultimately, because we're trying to find this interesting tension point in which people can be social with each other and discuss whether they find something attractive or repulsive. Ultimately, by discussing stuff like that and talking about our feelings, it's really, really important because this is how we make decisions. And this here is the Prime Minister. He always does this incredible walkthrough in which his kind of like elite kind of members of government go through and discuss whether they like stuff and how it makes them feel. And actually, of course, if you only need to look at advertising to know that like how something makes you feel can change your behavior overnight. And so this is all about positioning people into an immersive future and having them feel what it's like to live, even for 5 minutes, in this future, and react to it viscerally, because it can change the way they imagine what they want to see in the future. And so some of the work that we do at Tela is very much like traditional innovation. It's about reacting to the context of today. We were talking about this earlier, like when a client comes up to you and they're like, we face these problems, we need to do a study and figure out how we get from A to B and improve the situation. And what we came across was this wildly speculative, long-term, strategic stuff of design fiction, where you're just kind of imagining the wildest ideas out there and saying, is this interesting to talk about? And what we want to try and do, and what we're trying to apply to other clients now, is explore this middle ground in which it's what we're calling applied futures, where we're kind of taking the grounded approach to that, the prototype-driven kind of next steps approach of that, and these kind of wild ideas, and finding these kind of this mix, this middle point in which you can actually experience something of this wild future to help you have a debate around it, which we find really, really purposeful. And it kind of harks back to something which has always been, as I mentioned in Tela from the beginning, about translation, like from making products which have this data layer which we need to understand. Like how do we take products of today and the future which are kind of rich in ways that we never imagined and understand how they can fit into our lives? And for us, this kind of just extends how we've always been about translating information into stories and making products into something that you can understand the affordances of. This is a terrible example. And so on. And I want to just touch on this one because it just shows you this concept car, which we created for Toyota. It shows you like how this manifests in different contexts, because the automotive industry is one in which the products themselves are the manifestation. This is similar to the Dubai project in that the concept products are the manifestation of a product innovation pipeline, which is at once kind of trying to create meaningful prototypes of what they want to produce, and also creating a long-term vision for the company, and also acting as a marketing vessel to the outside world. And so trying to figure out how we apply this futures practice to much more grounded things, like what the next product is what we're all about and what we're trying to create. So that's it.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Really exciting. I would like now to invite you with us for a dialogue. We would start just rearranging the space, and we just then are open also to the question for the audience.
Cool. Can I join you down there? I feel really awkward.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Nice. Anybody else?
So I guess I have to speak to the microphone. It's only for the recording purposes, so it's not audio enhanced. So very exciting presentation. I must say I'm very sold. Like I'm even from the images. I'm believer. I was then at the same time thinking parallel how we can maintain like somehow unsold, or is you as where you creating those scenarios thinking about that you have to maintain also your critical point of view. Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it appears. Yeah, I have my own. It appears when you're looking at the manifestation of this stuff that it is like purely techno-utopian, and actually like we've got in magazines and newspapers and stuff, like people have said like, oh, just assume that it's all techno-utopian. But it's been an interesting journey of trying to create provocation where we can. In that kind of culture, I have to be honest, like when I first went to the country, I'd never been to Dubai before, and I was going with a presentation deck of all of the technologies that I thought would be massively disruptive in the next sort of like 10, 15 years. And I was going to tell them about Tor as one of the examples, and the dark web and the Silk Road marketplace and how that's about trading drugs and guns and children. And I was like, on the plane, I was like, is this okay? Like, can I talk about this stuff? I don't even know, And so actually, it's been a really interesting journey of trying to walk this line between optimistic techno-utopianism and sort of critical dialogue in shifting perspectives where we can. And some of that stuff is manifested really weirdly. Like we found that, not with our clients, but like when you're presenting to a wider, maybe sometimes more conservative audience, that manifested in the way that we represented our ideas as well. Like we wanted to create an animation of somebody swallowing a pill, like a kind of, like a two-dimensional cross-section animation. We couldn't do that because like culturally it's not okay to show the inside of someone's body. Just historically. And yet other places we found enormous, we're way more progressive when it comes to the role of women in society and divorcees and other stuff like that. So yes, it's supposed to be both. But I think when you take it out of context, out of the Dubai, Middle East context, in which it's not just Dubai, it's also there's Qatar and Saudi Arabia who are coming to visit, and bring it to today, to the Western world, yes, it feels like utopian, but we tried to be critical. And there was a huge amount of critical discussion.
So the exhibition now in the VA is the first time that you tested in the Western part of the world?
Well, the moral machine was in Switzerland, in Davos, and that was the first time, because that's like all of the Western governments interrogating this kind of concept of the ethical dilemma of algorithmic governance. And in the V&A, it's not specifically about, it's a different project. It's about they're asking which elements in the world should be designed? What should we consider to be something that's designed. And so we're trying to kind of like apply some of our thinking in a new context, but it's not framed like this. So it's quite different, yeah. But actually they wanted to collect that because it was an artifact of this process, which was a futures process used to design governance, which is really interesting.
I was just going to pick up on that. I think it's extremely interesting that the content that was defined through this process came from a intersection of you guys, a Western group, it seems like mostly, with the UAE as a kind of non-democracy, and that it seems like a real testing ground for different algorithmic governance, as you say, and almost like a opening up of a survey or like their own sort of extremely interactive referendum where they're inviting a series of scenarios and trying to get feedback from citizens about what the response was. Was that the kind of intention, or because I understand it was also extremely short term, right?
Yeah, they're just open for like 4 days. Yeah.
So an insane investment from their part into a very short term. So was that the goal, to kind of get feedback from individuals, or was it more like promotional on the side of the government? Or
I think it was, so the goal was really to so yes, it was, it's a lot of investment, but like those 3-4 days are the moment where everyone who has influence in that region comes together and has a chance to discuss important stuff, like. So while it was short term, it was probably, if you're going to create a sting at the right moment and create impact, then that was a great thing to try and do. So that's what they were attempting. But they were trying to provoke debate around these topics which weren't being discussed on a public platform, and that they wanted to be discussed more explicitly in government and at different levels of government as well, because there are lots of people who are, it's quite a deferential society, and so like lots of people who are at lower levels in government were just kind of like following orders, but actually they wanted to provoke the kind of like creative initiative development at all levels of government beyond that. And they created sort of parallel initiatives to try and provoke that as well. With regard to whether it was a data collection exercise, I guess what you're hinting towards is like a kind of, like a exercise in sort of democracy to some degree. I would say that actually it's really interesting that that kind of feedback process happens a lot there, but it's very much more hierarchical and familial, which is what you would expect. You say it's not a democracy, but actually nothing goes through government there without being tested with all of the families which are sort of have all of these lineages, and it's a kind of, it harks back to the old sort of tribal days. And so it isn't a Western form democracy, but actually there's a huge amount of socializing of new policies and initiatives that spin off the back of a provocative sort of statement piece like this. Whether that extends so far as like people who, it's like I don't really feel like I can speak to like how, like the UAE has of course like a huge immigrant workforce, and I don't think that's for everybody there, but that's another ethical question which we could only begin to address.
And then also it was funny that on the pavilion there was written also open for the public.
It was.
Because this is a common thing which you have here in Amsterdam, that every museum, that every pavilion is most likely going to be open for the public, but you have to write it like as big as the logo next to it, also open for the public.
Yeah.
So that was quite interesting to see also.
Well, I mean, it's like I don't know if you've been. Probably I haven't even been to Davos, but like when our team went to install the thing in Switzerland for the Davos event, it's like with these world leaders there, it's like super lockdown. So you can't even go near. There's probably like snipers on the roof and stuff. So it wasn't explicit. People would. It's a tourist destination as well. This thing is that there's a whole shopping mall there. So there were tons of people that saw it. Especially from across the water, you would be able to see this enormous, like, iconic, monolithic kind of white structure, and yet there's like metal detectors and like security guards. So it had to be explicit.
It goes very much along the discussion that we have also in the office. Can I have the microphone?
Steve was just pointing I have to speak into the microphone. We have this discussion in our office about museums being public or private, and if a public museum still exists. And I think then putting on a museum saying it's open for public is quite a funny statement, and again, and goes along with this discussion of like what is private and what is public, and creating a museum in a very artificial hospitality environment is also quite unusual thing, which would not happen that way maybe in Europe, or as far as I know.
I don't think you could call. I was always very conflicted about this notion of calling it a museum, because it's not a museum, objectively. But because it's only like a temporary event thing, it doesn't mean the same thing. It's not an institution which has like longevity in the same way as you might think here. But like in terms of the term, it created a kind of authority that was useful in that context, right? It was like a browsable authority on the subject that you could kind of like peruse and take how much you wanted and then go through and then leave it. So it was more about the behavior of people that we wanted to create. And I guess it's kind of provocative to say museum of the future, which is some museums, of course, normally focus on things gone by rather than things of the future. And that captured people's imaginations, and it's really that simple. But yeah, I mean, public private, I'm intrigued by what discussion you're having.
Maybe we can open it up to the wider audience if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask.
Hi, thank you first of all. I was wondering if these visitors ever questioned the general security of these digital future
Security
scenarios.
Do you mean like privacy?
Yeah, like cyber crimes.
Yeah.
Like you give out so much data, even by like, for instance, you walk through or you scan your hands, whatever, like everything. Was there like discussion about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was one thing that we thought would become much more prevalent than it was, in fact. And I think culturally, that's because there's an extraordinary trust and expectation that the state kind of has access and looks after your data. It's it's not like in Europe, or even especially in Germany, where it's like it's like a rights issue, like they're not so advanced there in that thinking, We did have some interesting discussions around that, and we had panel sessions afterwards that specifically addressed that to try and get people thinking more actively about that, because there's all of these things are you're kind of reliant on lots of different technologies to get there, and there's lots and lots of different kind of impact areas to explore. So the answer is yes, but people weren't worried about it. They didn't really. Only the Westerners seem to care.
Are you worried about it?
Oh, I'm extraordinarily worried. I mean, I think that it's already too late, for us at least. Like maybe for our children, we can devise like a kind of legislative system in which they have a better understanding of what it means to be putting their data out into the world. But I mean, I'm already owned.
Game over.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing how suspicious we all are of governments collecting our data versus these huge platforms collecting our data, though. Like, the national identity card debate has been going for decades in Europe, and some countries have it, but then Facebook just went straight across that, and sort of people didn't really notice, and now there's becoming more and more awareness. But maybe the UAE and similar countries feel less threatened, or are sort of moving faster in the direction of digitizing government, because they feel more at ease with that process, because they're not used to kind of protecting.
Well,
because it's not democratic. I don't know if there's something.
It's less. I think it's less about the nature of the culture actually thinking about it than the way in which they're attempting to innovate government services, right? Like they have, for example, they have like a hotel rating system in Dubai, and it goes from not 1 to 5 stars, but this is Dubai, it goes to 7 stars. But there's only one hotel which has 7 stars, and that's the Burj Al Arab. And it's ridiculously expensive and whatever. But actually, what they introduced was a similar star-based rating system based on customer feedback for all of the government service departments that they have across the country, because they wanted the whole of the government service sector to be run as a private service would be run. Like, you're basically trying to, like, competing with each other. Like, you can choose if you want to get your social housing or your water or whatever it is that you need from the government, you can choose the service center you go to based on the ratings that it's got and the feedback that it's gotten. And they want to try and encourage that private sector-like inter-competition. And it extends to the data protection, because when you think about Facebook, you know, like, and Google and all of these things, how did they become so pervasive and own so much data? It's value exchange, you know. Like, when I started my Gmail account, it's like, I was like, oh, I'm one of the lucky ones to get a Gmail. Am I going to get my email address or not? And then it's like, wow, look at all of these services they're providing for free. I wouldn't be able to live my life without Google, you know. And so, like, it's not even a question. Like, I want those services in my life. I wouldn't be able to live my modern life without those services. I need that. So, and in doing so, I'm unwittingly, maybe, or maybe consciously, giving them all of my data. And in the UAE, it's the same. They're providing these services like a private institution might be, and they're trying to do the best possible service. Like, you go in, honestly, like, we were observing the social housing, you go into the social housing department, you get like a three-dimensional render that you can choose modularly between the different components of the social house, which is going to get built for you. You sit down in a waiting room and you get served dates and coffee. Like, it's like a hotel or something. It's not like.
Are there any downsides?
I'm not trying to sell this place. I just think that it's incredible for me how you can take. So just to close that point, it's a different model. It's a different, and also it's a business model. They're fully willing to make profit in the same way that we do in private enterprise here. But also, I find it incredible how I was expecting, and there is like injustice and there's unethical things which happen and stuff, but I was amazed by the amount of positive optimism and crazy, like, positive experiences that people were having with the government and their experience of the government out there. And even when you're in Dubai, like, if you talk to taxi drivers, I always talk to taxi drivers and Uber drivers, and they're happy, you know, and they're living in, like, you know, workers' kind of colonies just outside of town, but they're providing for like 3 or 4 families back in Pakistan, and they actually, ostensibly, on the whole, are having a great time, you know, having been living away from their families for 10 years. It's a peculiar place, and you have to be willing to take all of your preconceptions about what makes life better and turn them upside down, because it's not always the case. Like, we just have our way of looking at the world.
Yeah, you are addressing right now this exciting question of the relationship between a private company like Google and Facebook that provides services to you and the government. Wouldn't be another point to try to save that relationship apart, like that we have governments who are more willingly saving our interests versus the company who is more willingly trying to earn money with providing better and better services? What would be your take on that?
Like, what is my underlying ideology when it comes to, I am torn. I mean, I feel like I am a socialist at heart. I want to see more publicly owned, take back the railways, you know, in Britain at least. But like, it's like, at the same time, like, the government is calcified, spending is, I mean, we've been talking with some consultants who are working on the NHS right now. It's a maze of crazy bureaucracy, the way that works, that whole thing. And private enterprises are able to shift and change and innovate in much more agile, kind of at a faster pace. You know, like, I hate the capitalist nature of healthcare in America, but I love our NHS. But the NHS is screwed, and America is just kind of making money hand over foot. I don't think it's as easy as stating a single I think that it's actually a question of learning from the other and borrowing pieces of one and taking it across and figuring out how to experiment meaningfully. Seeing where we get to. I don't know. I wish I had a better answer. I'm sorry.
Are there any more questions from the audience, or do we have questions from our visitors online or viewers online?
Oh gosh.
First, our audience.
From online? This is the first time this has happened.
No one from the audience? Okay, then online.
Who is it?
Well, there's a lot of debate going on around Dubai generally.
Oh gosh.
And this is also, there's a question which is coming in from Pletorica, which is in the Museum of the Future generally, not the one that is there already, but in the Museum of the Future, and if the future is authoritarian, how can we address, or how can we create art that transgresses the status quo or that's critical of the government?
Well, I mean, that's a much bigger question. I think it's really important to contextualize this project as being a project of the government. So our job was to find ways to meaningfully provoke the debate inside the government toward areas that they weren't previously willing or able or just wasn't happening, like the subject areas. And so like it was an interesting experiment for the government to create transgression within itself, right? Like I don't know that I can speak to how society can create transgression in that context. I wouldn't want to incite that kind of stuff publicly. But I think it's an intriguing question, you know, like I think like beyond this project more broadly, it's important to realize that through our everyday actions and our decisions as consumers of politics and products and services and culture in general, we are making decisions about our future collectively. And as Ren said earlier, like it's about deciding what you want and what you believe in, and it's maybe a little bit harder to draw that line when you're in a country and you have the government to deal with. I wish that we didn't vote Brexit, you know, like, and I wish the government didn't act on it, but like, you know, I can in my way like try and do what I can.
Great, thanks. Any more questions?
One question also would be about the experience, like when you see the Museum of the Future, which kind of experiences you as a creator saw as the most successful ones in terms of having the biggest impacts? Did you guys have any like a recap on the Museum of the Future? Which one was really like kind of most influential one? What did you saw as something that really impacts the spectator or the visitor, and which one was less successful in your opinion?
I mean, I think that like let's see. I think that one of the most successful ones was the one which was about human agency. We called it Machinic Life. It was about how our lives will become increasingly machinic, and that was really nice because we experimented with being a little bit more didactic about what products and services exist today, not just products and services, but industries even exist today, which explicitly point towards the future we're about to show you. And so it made it a lot clearer for visitors how it's very directly related, because most of the people hadn't seen the stuff that we displayed, like a bionic leg that you could control from your brain, or they didn't know about algorithmic trading, which is of course like the micro trading, which happens all the time now. That people don't understand that stuff is happening by computers already. So that was extremely powerful as a mode of operation. But the experiences that were the most compelling and successful were the ones which were most colorful, theatrical, immersive, and ultimately photographable, because like people exist today in
Instagrammable.
Yeah, it's Instagrammable, exactly. Like that's like our client is always joking with us and saying, more smoke machines and more lasers, and we're like, dude, come on, this is serious. And he's like, I'm deadly serious, you know, like. And he's right, you know, like it's taken us a while to get there, but actually, like with this kind of stuff, like this is the nature of today. People are searching for this kind of theatrical experience, and to have an experience, to show that they've had an experience that was novel and unique, and then to be able to share that with their second audiences. I think that's where we saw the most success.
That's probably also why VR, you would rather make a screen all around a person rather than put a VR on the face, because you cannot really share it. Like, it's your VR experience. That's, you know, how do you share it on Instagram or
even with the person standing next to you?
Exactly.
It's private. Well, what we did with that was you had your VR experience, and then there was a screen just behind that showed exactly what you were looking at, so you could watch someone do it. But this is like the kind of thing that museums are. This is not unique to this, of course. Like, museums, theme parks are struggling with this all the time. VR roller coasters coming next. Probably already exists. It does. Oh, we didn't make it.
From the process point of view, how do you test those vision scenarios? Is it because, for example, as we progress, we do renders, we do animation, we do 3D modeling? What would be your nature of testing those things? Which one will be the best?
We do all of that stuff. I mean, when it comes to the scenarios, the first thing is to test them with different. I mean, we involve lots of different people, and then as the scenarios res up into ideas that we can imagine experiences around, we start to prototype stuff very quickly to try and manifest what that experience will be like. And we have people sit and do it. You know, like this is our practice generally. Often, in order to create this kind of stuff, I mean, I should say that what we're trying to do here, which is difficult, is create an experience of the future using technologies which only exist today. You know, so they're all, you have to kind of give yourself, you have to sort of willingly suspend your disbelief, and you know that it's only a VR headset. You know that this stuff isn't real, but we're always trying to prototype the most successfully immersive version of that. And in doing so, we often have to invent new storytelling devices, like that ball thing, which was like a totally new interface. Like, no one had developed, as far as I know, like a reflective gaming ball which allowed you to do this kind of stuff. And we had to test lots of different versions. We had to test all of the different paint surfaces. You know, like, this is kind of micro architecture when it comes to that stuff. But it's just a question of prototyping. We are inventors and shapers of materials that in fact, that's like like what I was kind of talking about at Frame recently. It's about how to learning how to use emerging technologies. Like, we like to think of those things as materials. That's what's important about it. Yeah.
I was just thinking how it's interesting. Your work is extremely interdisciplinary. That you're sort of designing and speculating futures and working with governments and kind of. It seems like a lot of sort of traditional silos of professions are moving much more and more together. Also, the museum being a spectacle and being a kind of almost marketing piece for the client. And I was wondering about this kind of shift towards maybe a focus on skills rather than individual professions. And I read a very dystopian article the other day about a future scenario where a woman wakes up and is taken into an autonomous vehicle and then kind of driven to an out-of-town industrial warehouse and does a job there that she's been assigned on a phone. And the idea that you don't own your job anymore and you don't even know what you're doing day to day. But maybe rather than being driven to this out-of-town place, it's more like you develop clusters of jobs based on skills. So there would be a kind of creative hub, or there would be a more like logic hub, and then you would do jobs based on that kind of skill base, and that's how you're split up.
Sure. It's a natural extension of the gig economy, right? You know, like it's I think that the notion of professions is, I mean, you only need to think about the medical profession and the NHS again, like and how like that's almost been its downfall to some degree, like hyper specialization and the inadequate use of basically expert hands across tens of things because they're not doing that one operation that they're designed to do, trained to do. I think that our education system is going to need to do some serious catching up in order to skill people with, like, I guess more like unitary skills that can be more, like more, what's the word? Like spread across different arenas, and I think professions is gonna die out.
Also, I guess in relation to automation and AI and future-proofing our careers, also that we can adapt over time and take on different roles.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Do we have any more from? Yeah.
It seems most everything you do is quite controlled in the sense that you're trying to anticipate what the outcome is. I was wondering about the hypermind. You're talking about algorithms where there's some sort of like interaction happening. I was wondering, were you planning on farming data or trying to gather statistics to analyze to actually create something real? Was that just all theatrical, or were you
This
thinking
is all
about
theatrical. Like, I think that we would love to do that more. I think that that in particular is a very scary, potentially dystopian concept. But I do think that like experimenting hands-on with it more is actually the right thing to do in order to figure out whether it's something we want or not. But that's not something we're doing right now. It's something that probably Google will be doing right now.
No, I'm just thinking, because we did discuss it a while back of, for example, like creating some interactive thing by the front of the office where mood could be judged, like the mood of the world could be judged by colors.
Oh, I see, yeah.
But I was just kind of wondering if you were also playing with ideas, maybe for other projects where you were planning on finding ways of gathering data and then transforming it into some other expression.
Yeah, and you'll be incredibly amazed by the kind of inferences that you can make from data these days. I was talking to an energy company recently, and with the smart meters, you'll be amazed to find out that it's possible to tell which TV program you're watching just from your smart meter. Like, there is the data science which is happening around us right now. We're not data scientists, but for sure, like, I'd love to talk about creating an installation which is exploring some of those manifestations of the stories which are around us in data and how our culture manifests in the data points that exist all around us. Yeah, it's awesome.
No, because I know in the office here, they get quite excited about making diagrams.
All right.
You know? And it seems to me that that's a lot more dynamic. You know, it's like something which can actually be like a type of future wallpaper or a type of
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
type of art. But, okay, thank you.
So, yep, I think, do we have any more questions from the audience or from the web? No. Okay, that's, I think that would be the wrap up in that case. We will continue at the beers around the corner. Please join us if you have a second. We will go to the bar at nearby the Hoodspot. And Paul, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure. And
thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.